All right, Megan, that was awesome. Thank you. Okay, great to see a few of you here. I'm excited that there seems to be a good energy in the room, and I'm not really 100% sure how much time I'm supposed to take, but I guess you'll boo me out or play me out when it's time. First of all, thanks so much for Matt and Zach for inviting me here, and this sort of really inspiring grassroots kind of initiative, which I think we'll have to just copy and do in Winnipeg as well, because I think it's working out great. And there's really an important need to have discussions about city futures beyond the architectural profession. So I appreciate the fact that there's members of the public that are involved. So about 546, we began in 2007, so 15 years coming, or this past May. And I'm one of the co-founders, as you heard, and my partner Sasha and I started the company with this idea that we really wanted to fight ambivalence about design issues in our city. So we're very much similar to you in a sense that there was, or as it used to be, that there was, car culture, there's sprawl, there's the typical North American issues. With smaller cities, we're about 650 to 750,000 people. And then there's really nothing around there, so there's no triangle. There's just Winnipeg in the middle of this vast province. We are we're actually in this geographical center of North America. So what that actually means, and you may not be aware of this, is that Winnipeg is about 8 hours north by car from Minneapolis. And that is the geographic center. So clearly we're important from that perspective. But having this sort of isolation, and Minneapolis would actually be the closest big city to us. The other one in Canada would be Calgary, that's about 14 hours west. And so it's isolated city, and that in effect has really shaped the way that we think and who we are. It's also a slow growth city, so not like Raleigh, we have very slow growth pattern, and fortunately though, it has saved some of our old buildings like this one here. We have a very good sort of stock of historic buildings as a result of not there being a lot of development pressure at different times. As The Simpsons put it, there's really no reason to be in Winnipeg. So Sasha and I are both immigrants to the city. He was a former war refugee, or a war refugee from the former Yugoslavia is what I meant to say. And I am a exchange student from Helsinki, Finland, and that's how we both ended up in Canada, in Manitoba. As I was telling Matt earlier, I think it was yesterday, that I got sent to a small town of 8 people in rural Manitoba. So that would be like, I don't know if you can picture that. There's 4 houses, there's a church, and there's a convenience store. So it was pretty rad for sort of an 18-year-old to be coming from a sort of a pretty vibrant European city to this place with farmers and cows and nothing in the horizon, just flat land everywhere. But I think, again, there's something about those places that shape you and kind of get you to think about who you are. Now, Winnipeg and Manitoba is pretty extreme. So we go from not only this heat that you have here, we go to kind of minus 40 Fahrenheit as well in the winter. And it really shapes the way that you build buildings, of course, because what happens is not only just the envelope that has to be super thick, and your details, those of you who are in architecture, aren't going to be elegant. They're going to be pretty sort of solid. But also we're a former lake bottom, so about 30% of our effort in terms of the resources, money, goes into the ground. So before we can build up, we build piles and foundations in the ground. And so what's left for architecture is pretty marginal. And that sort of thinking has shaped the way that our office operates. So it's about the kind of basics, and what can we do, and what can we do that's not frivolous and can't be cut out of the budget as the project moves along. And of course, I just need to recognize before I move forward that there's a whole group of people. These are people who've been in the office, and some of them are still there. We're about 20 people today, but obviously all of the work is collective. It's not mine per se. So just wanted to make sure you know that. The practice ecosystem is something that we've titled the lecture, and it sort of talks about this role of an architect that goes beyond, like it does in situ. It goes beyond just just doing the traditional lane of the commissioned project. And so in our minds, there's collaborations and osmosis that happens in the office. There's design competitions that we take part in. There's juries. There's design giving that we try to do because nobody else would. So whatever financial success we have, then we pass that on to other things to try to build design culture. We have academic pursuits. We do exhibitions. We try to write, working on several books, sort of thought leadership for the community. We're trying to be politically engaged, to try to act as advisors on a number of city and urban design issues, and housing in particular. We try to apply for awards and publications because that gives us further opportunities and recognition and kind of scales us against other worldwide sort of organizations out there. Design activism is huge. We do that, and that would be sort of what you guys are doing here. And then, of course, the traditional plane of lane of the practice. And it all kind of, I won't get into this, but is enabled by trying to also recognize that architecture can't just be a hobby. It has to be a, functioning business. So in the future, I think that architecture has to become kind of a less of an image-driven art. I think architects and architecture have this task of becoming more strategic and be more political, address the compounding inequality and social justice issues, so that we can build a better world for the 99% that we haven't really traditionally been addressing. Architects and architecture, I think, has to do better using smart tools, advocate, create policy, get involved in politics so that the capacity of all people, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within the community can survive, adapt, and thrive. So re-examining and rewriting the regulatory and fiscal policies should certainly go towards increasing affordability and equity for all. So that kind of is foundational to how we think. From the conception of the firm, we've been focusing on the missing middle, or the mid-rise housing, trying to really kind of be part of the lives of ordinary people going about their everyday lives. And we didn't choose it. It sort of came to us. Before, we could shape it, it shaped us, so to speak. And there's been sort of several efforts in that housing arena. And when we started, we were very local. For the first 10 years, probably, we only practiced in Winnipeg. And then just recently, we've been kind of expanding across the country from Calgary, Edmonton, Victoria, Saskatoon, Regina. You may not know where those are, but basically coast to coast. Canada exists sort of 100 miles from the border, at the southern border, is where 90% of our population, even 95% of our population is. And then there's the far north, which of course is important, but is less sort of architecturally shaped, I guess, at this point. So we're currently kind of compiling information for a book that we're writing on housing, and more on that later, but through this effort, we sort of had counted number of housing units that we've sort of come through our, or past our desks, and as you can see, sort of includes anything from just a couple of units to about 1,000 on any given site. So back to the idea of this ambivalence. Where I grew up, so this is the Finnish money before the euro came in the early 2000s. It had Alvar Aalto in it, and architects or architectural, students here know who that is, but was on our money. And to me, it somehow is indicative of the value that the society placed on design and the importance of how it shapes people's lives. So there's not a president on the money, but it's an architect. And somehow, I guess, to the beginning of our firm, we were searching for that kind of conversation that was lacking, or the recognition that was lacking that design actually does have a huge impact on what we're doing. So this first little project was sort of a lesson in that. We participated in a small local competition in our exchange district, which is that historic part of the city that I was showing some images, historic images before. And the question was to replace on the right top hand side, you can see an existing bandshell stage that was in one of the small parks in that historic district. from the 70s, and to come up with a proposal for its kind of revitalization. The big idea was that, for us, was that it was empty for 321 days of the year. There were only sort of 44 events throughout the year, and we thought that when there's no event, it felt really sad and kind of empty and quiet. And we were hoping to build something architecturally that would feel complete when there was no event. And so the idea of this shape, of the primary shape of the cube came from there, and then kind of immediately got traction and won the competition. And then the rest of the time we were really just working on how we would make it possible. And the first ideas were about kind of opening some slabs in it and opening it into a stage and then closing it up. But through vandalism and different things that we had to consider, it sort of imploded in instead. It's made out of 20,000 of these little aluminum pieces that are shaped like slices of salami, I guess, from an extruded piece of aluminum tube, and then woven together through stainless steel cable. And what was really interesting is that we discovered halfway through our process that if you project with the projector through Venetian blinds, essentially the picture gets transferred to the other side. I mean, who knew? I didn't know. And so the funny thing is that you can actually put a projector inside of it and you get a perfect image. You get, you know, sort of poor man's version of an LED screen back in 2010. And, you know, pre-pandemic, it now has 4 times of the events, so almost 200 events, 200 days of the year that's actually busy. When it's hibernating, it still has music and it can be programmed by artists with light and so on. So from that perspective, a really sort of successful project and really popular place to take wedding photographs for some reason. But so the Winnipeg Jazz Festival has their event here every year. The Fringe, which is our theater show, just ended this year, and so on. But that's not the point. The point I'm showing you this project is the fact that what it did is absolutely made people hate this thing. It was called the Cheese Crater. We got hate mail for it. There was a Facebook page that was set up just to like tear down the cube. And then on the other hand, it was, you know, in Lonely Planet as one of the places to visit in Winnipeg, and there was this architectural press that really loved it. And all of a sudden you're having this dialogue about architecture. Everybody had an opinion about architecture, which was more than we could have ever hoped for prior to that. And so we had this sort of beginning of an understanding that, you know, you have to kind of have the guts to do stuff, to have those conversations and have thick skin to also be able to absorb sometimes the fair and sometimes the unfair criticism that you get when you put your heart and soul out there. So back to the ecosystem then. This is the competition. So again, like trying to measure yourself against things, housing competitions, different competitions. We usually don't have a lot of success. Sometimes we do, but we try to do that every year. We set a budget aside so that we can do them, because we do think that there should be a better competition culture in our city to also promote quality in architecture. Publications and things like that. We've actually gotten clients through this way. We had an article about a stupid thing in an en route magazine, which is Air Canada's, so our national airline, flight magazine, and got a call from a big developer as a result of it. We connected with another developer through Instagram, and so these things, you know, are not only sort of self-affirming or self-congratulatory, but they do result in opportunities that we can make a bigger difference in the future. Participate in juries and things like that, just to see what's out there and how we can do better. One of the major early efforts that we did was trying to create design culture in our city, was turning Canada's representation in 2012 Venice Biennale into a national competition. So we got commissioned to do a project in Venice. Instead, we did 9 different events throughout Canada so that we could get better sponsorships for the event. So it's not very well funded. There's a whole story to this. So we were able to collect $650,000 for the project through actually touring it through Canada, and then created opportunity for 35 Canadian young practitioners to go to Venice to kind of celebrate their projects there. More recently at the University of Manitoba, which is our local university, created a sort of a build exhibition, which was trying to explore all the things that we try to do in cladding materials to try to do better or do something different than the off-the-shelf materials. There's an exhibition, part of the design, what is it, festival in Toronto, in partnership with the furniture store. But we also do things like mayoral debates, or we organize talks in our office that are called On the Board. So architects get together and kind of have a studio session with each other, meaning that you have to be able to withstand critique coming from your colleagues that, okay, maybe you do better. And the idea is, again, raising the bar. On our fringe festivals in architecture, on our frozen river, we're part of initiating a thing called warming huts with a guy who actually runs it. His name is Peter Hargraves, but we were can I turn this down? Is there some way to turn the sound off? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm skating. Is there some way to turn it off? No? Okay. David, can you just dial the whole thing down? I don't have any others. We don't need the sound. No? What do you want to do? No, it doesn't do anything. Okay, I'll skip. I'll try to go fast. Sorry. I'm trying to get past this. So just look at the pictures. It doesn't move any faster, I apologize. Okay, I'm so embarrassed. I hope this stops soon. Last slide. Oh, sorry. Okay, I don't know what happened. Okay, so that was warming huts. So you can see that there are little warming huts along our frozen river in the winter. January and February, when it's frozen, it's the Guinness World Record of the longest skating trail, so about 12 kilometers, what is that, 8 miles or something like that. So you can skate on the frozen river, and it's been a long time before Winnipeg was really embracing its conditions, and people were getting outside in the sort of minus 30 Fahrenheit weather, 40, if you will. And so the point is that you can always find a way for people to kind of find the joy in the everyday and take over those urban spaces. We'll move on. So then the next kind of advocacy project is we were lucky enough to get the Prix de Rome for Canada, which means that professionally you get a grant money to do a project. And what we proposed to do in order to win it was to have dinner and a bunch of wine in 8 different cities across the world to find out from those cities, which we figured were design cities, and what they do. How do they perpetuate design culture? What builds it? Who maintains it? Where does it come from? What can we do? And how do we bring those lessons back home? And so as you can see, we're having a great time having dinner with all kinds of key influencers in those cities. So we had a local connection, and we went to learn these lessons. And it's amazing what people will tell you when they've had a little bit to drink and good food to eat. So, and then we wanted to sort of really kind of play that off when we came back to Winnipeg, finally after the year's run of this, and different members of the team were going down to different cities, and so we partnered up with Storefront Manitoba, which is sort of an advocacy organization that we have these days, and organized the table for 1,200 instead of the table for 12 that happened in these other cities. And it was pretty amazing. It sort of took its cue from the Nuit Blanche, which is the Parisian kind of originated dinner where you kind of get in consistent clothing and you bring a chair and it's a surprise event. Nobody knows where it is until it happens. And having to sort of coordinate 150 tables of 8, and each had a table captain. They had to have a design for their table setting, and we had our culture minister actually judge them and pick her favorite and so forth. So it was really successful, and now it's actually a fundraising event that takes place every year. So minus the 2 years in pandemic, it again happened this year. It's been going on ever since, and makes actually up for the bigger part of the Storefront Manitoba's funding for each year. The next advocacy project was called Share Your Idea, and this was just a little, my partners call these, like, I'm mostly initiated in these stupid things, and he calls them, or my 2 partners call them lose your shirt kind of projects, which they typically are. So I put a lot of effort into them, and we essentially kind of pay for the effort and that sort of thing. But it's our way of giving back. So this one was asking any Winnipegger, any sort of regular folk out there to have an idea, sort of an urban guerrilla idea that we could do for $30,000. And to write it in a format that it would fit Twitter, which was, I think, 140 characters at the time. And then we would put a chair out in the public realm where that idea was written. And then, you could have a conversation with your neighbor about it, hopefully would instigate the next idea. And at the end of that competition, then, with those funds that we collected for the entry fees, which was $25 each, we were able to have that $30,000 to implement one. And not only that, but the Winnipeg's mayor, who's pictured there, then got a book of 1,000 ideas that the city could consider doing in the future. But also, this one is one of my favorites in a sense that, I hope there's no sound in this. There's not. Okay, good. So the scale of change also can be incremental, and it can be achieved with small means. So this is a project called One Bucket at a Time. It's a collaboration with Factor Eficiencia from Mexico City, reclaiming public space back from the corrupt entrepreneurs of Mexico City called Viene Viene. The Viene Viene place ordinary painter's buckets in the public realm to create parking stalls where they don't exist, and then charge money for the parking stall. And it's sort of a corrupt operation. The police are in on it. They get a cut. Of course, it was sort of a temporary installation. We were invited to go there, trying to draw awareness of the issue, but it was super amazing to see this thing come to life in Mexico City. It was used really intensely for 3 days, and it sort of played on this idea that the painter bucket was slightly tapered. And so then once you kind of strung that together with ropes in the back of it, it created this cool little shape and wave that you could surf on almost. And then once we released the thing into the crowd after the fact, it sort of disappeared in sort of a matter of hours. People would claim these buckets back into whatever use they would have in their household. And then, but the even better part of it in my mind was that we then brought it back to Winnipeg as part of our design festival, and it got rebuilt there. And then we had this idea that we would then sell the buckets for $20 each for Winnipeggers to donate for a good cause, which was a girl orphanage in Mexico City. So they kind of got sent back in our minds, full of hope. We collected about $10,000 for the orphanage that you see here. So, I mean, I guess in a way, it was sort of a proof that you could actually make a tangible difference to somebody's life who really needed it. Slightly more kind of frivolous project in that sense. Design Quarter Winnipeg is something that I design quarters or design districts that I've encountered back in my hometown of Helsinki. Basically just map out where are the creative businesses, what are they doing, what's already out there, and what are they in a sort of a walkable distance. And so when I go back and I'm a tourist in my own hometown, I pick up one of these maps and I actually go to different stores to see what people are making and how they're making it. And I sort of started mapping out what Winnipeg had already, and about 60 different businesses I thought sort of qualified to be that, and then put together a business plan for it, collected the startup funding, and then we hired ED, and it's been running since 2017. Obviously, the pandemic was not kind, so we'll see what the future of it is, but it was sort of successful. And the idea is collective marketing, the power of that collective in order to help those businesses bring Winnipeggers to the core area, to discover those businesses, and to kind of entice the appreciation and walkability within the core area of the city. And in terms of the political realm, I've been in the MAA, is the Manitoba Association of Architects, and started something. Holy smokes, that's excellent. But quality-based selection is not something that in Canada is widely accepted in public projects. So trying to sort of put a task force together and talk about it. I know in the States it's much more common for public projects, but really trying to get the profession to be selected for its sort of the quality that they offer, rather than sort of pure toilet paper, like as in like the cheapest price wins. The other such effort has been being chair of the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce and starting something in that. So usually it's just sort of I guess you're an MC of an event. So there's an event every month, and it gets the business leaders of the community together, and they have a luncheon, and you kind of announce people, and you do this sort of thing. So I convinced them that I should do a 3-minute, which is actually was always at least 6 minutes, but a short section on urban design issues, so that I could talk to the business people about why this makes business case, why it makes sense to care about design. And these are some of the slides that I created for that. And so trying to put it in terms of numbers, so walkable cities have a higher GDP than ones that are not, by 38%. It actually, you get better return on investment for every biking and walking For every $1 invested, sorry, I forgot, biking and walking provide an estimated return on investment of that much. It's actually a negative for cars. Times Square is there, when they pedestrianized it, it led to reduction in crime, decrease in accidents and car travel time, while seeing the rise of retail sales of 172%. Things like the Swedish study found that people who endure, and endure is the right word, more than a 45-minute commute, were 40% more likely to get a divorce. On the other hand, if a single person exchanging long commute for a short walk to work has the same effect on happiness as finding new love. So why wouldn't we build better cities? So walking just 15 minutes a day can reduce the risk of dying by 22% for people over 60. So this all, and there's more of them. Winnipeg is one of the least dense cities in our country. You can see they're in kilometers here, but 1,430 people per square kilometer. I looked up Raleigh's number, it's even less, it's 1,200 something. So you've got some work to do on that arena. But if you look at this is the footprint of Winnipeg here, and if you were to be at the density of Paris, which doesn't have any tall buildings, we're not talking Tokyo or New York here, it would fit in that 35 square kilometers. So like fraction of the size, so 7.5% of its footprint. And you can understand why we don't have resources to do good public transit, why we can't invest into better services, better libraries, and things like that create community. So I was trying to prove that point. In fact, I looked at the Winnipeg's city budget, and over 70% of it goes to things that have directly to do with distance. So in terms of the length of sewer pipe and roads and maintaining them and so on. And so it's really hard to kind of not do something to build in as opposed to out, which further perpetuates the problem that we have. And there's a study from Halifax, again, this is far east in Canada, but study that the servicing, just purely servicing, once it's built, from a city budget, it's about $2,000 difference between a suburban and an urban home. And so if I take the same metric, what that meant for Winnipeg is that we would save over $4 billion in 25 years by putting our new construction within the existing city footprint as opposed to allocating new greenfield for development. And this is just just the sort of the next 25 years of 80,000 residents that we need going forward, to house about 200,000 people. And I think one of the big issues with housing and why affordability is such an issue that's hard to overcome and hard for the architectural profession to tackle is the financification of housing. And so the real estate investment, using housing as a financial instrument. So we have investors, offshore investments in Vancouver in particular that keep housing vacant, keep it off the market for the ordinary people and so on. So something has to shift, even in Canada where we're socialist. To really highlight also what the other issue is, that the average North American occupies about 4 times the square footage per person, personal space in our houses and homes, than the average Asian, or twice as much as the average European. So when we think about the environmental issue, the environmental crisis that is on our hands, something has to shift there. The other factor that I talked to some of the students earlier today is about when we think about how do we solve the affordable housing crisis in this country and in our country, we have to recognize that compared to Northern Europe, where I'm from, approximately 35% in good cases of the public, or for the housing stock, overall housing stock. So every unit you have out there built in America, or any country for that matter, but in Europe it's about 35% of that is public or supported housing that has public funding. And so that's how you make things affordable, that's how you create equity. In Canada that's about 4%, which is pretty damn pathetic. And I won't say anything about the US, you can see the number there. 0.7%, yeah. So anyway, so all of this kind of political standing on the soapbox stuff led to us inviting Jan Gehl, who's one of the sort of foremost, is a Danish architect, for those of you who might not know, came to speak with the business crowd. And it was a sold out room, and I was pretty stoked about the whole thing. He really captured the audience, and it was excellent. But and at the end of it, we got a policy paper that the Chamber of Commerce of Winnipeg put together that really tried to promote infill housing and walkability and so on. So relatively proud of that, but of course more work to be done. And then from the beginning, I think what's helped our practice to try and do good work or do work that's considered critical or whatever you want to call it, is that we're always thinking in terms of numbers. We were educated by a bunch of developers. We have to understand that there's no project unless we can make the numbers work. And then where we can carve architecture out is the remainder. So as long as they make a profit, we have a case to be made. So that's something that kind of is ingrained in us, and we're always kind of going the sort of numbers forward in all of the things. And then the other thing that governs the practice or the way that we think about housing in particular is looking at the in-between. So these are the kinds of spaces that I grew up in. I've never lived in a house, neither has Sasha, my partner. And I'm there in number 3 in the skiing in Helsinki in our apartment complex. But what I think defines multifamily housing, which I do think is the answer to some of these issues, affordability, environmental crisis, the kind of amount of land that we occupy and so on, is trying to build more of it and make it affordable and convince more people that it's actually feasible and a desirable place to live. So what the difference in my mind, though, is this kind of space that exists between buildings. So it's not taken up by other things, but it's place structures, it's places for seniors to sit around, it's sort of defined urban rooms that exist between buildings. And versus what in Canada was the first place that I lived in a multifamily housing project. You can see that space is a parking lot and it's a garbage can. And that's how we in North America allocate that space in between buildings. And I think that's a huge difference. So how do you ask families to live here? Well, you don't. They don't have a place to go that they can claim as their own. And it's even in the language, like the way that I would say that I'm from, not for building, but from a yard. So we would use this word piha, and I would say I'm from that piha, which kind of places a different value on what's important. It wasn't the buildings, it was the space in between. Anyway, so back to the Winnipeg conditions. So how can you do stuff as architects that that is enticing, we can only afford, because of that 30% going into the ground and the temperature swings and envelopes that are required, we can only afford stucco, hardy board, cementitious board, or some sort of metal cladding, as there's no brick, there's nothing fancy, there's no stone, there's none of that stuff. And so just, keeping that in mind, it's rudimentary materials and always trying to reinvent things around these things. But I do think that it's possible still to create architecture that's worthwhile. Going into a couple of projects, this is the Winnipeg, one of the major rivers. There's Red River. It runs north into the Hudson Bay, coming from North Dakota, I guess. And there's our new Human Rights Museum that was built a few years back by Anton Predock, won the competition. And this is Waterfront Drive, the line that you see. And so weirdly enough, we've been able to build several projects along this path that's sort of like Winnipeg turning itself back onto its resources, main resources, the natural resources, the river. Instead of being industrial lands, the frontier is turned into public amenity and so on. The first project is called UCube. It's just a small little project. Again, some of the stats here, 18 units. We got a young developer that wanted to put a project together. And the story on the project is that he came from the house building trade. I think he was 28 at the time. He knew residential contractors, and they're considerably cheaper than commercial ones. And so there was a sort of a trick for us to try to figure out what is the building form that we can create that allows him to tap into that more affordable construction trade group. And so it turned into, and it's industrial, so this will date me badly. So kids, when iPods were a thing, back in the early 2000s, we were in studio, we were teaching a studio and young in our careers, and then somehow the idea of you could have your own identity, but it's contained in the same thing. Okay, I won't go in. So industrial fringe area, sort of turning into, transitioning from that industrial past into more residential neighborhood. This was the project scheme, so we essentially went from building block where you have to build corridor and space that you have to heat into sort of 100% efficient project. Again, money-wise, that makes a lot of sense. Everybody has their own front door at an upper deck and so forth. And so 18 individual units, 3 to 4 stories. There was some tricks in there. We had to have 1-to-1 parking ratio still, so we lifted the thing up, which also provided, it was 6 feet off the ground, provided some security from the neighborhood that was still transitioning, and then had this sort of place where people could connect. Inside of the units, it's sort of, the blocks there, they would either start on the ground floor and have access to the street, or they would start on the upper deck above the driveway and go up from there. And then at the top, there's sort of rooftops where community members could also talk to one another across the parapet. And then inside, rather naive idea, but we wanted to somehow rethink housing, right? This wrap that went in the building, and they were vertically organized. Sometimes, half of the units were flipped so that your living room was at the top, and you get the best view of the city beyond the sort of immediate surroundings that were still a bit sketchy. Then we pretty immediately, it took some years to get going, but the same developer with other partners came to us and asked if he could make housing work on this industrial site. It's behind industrial sheds. There's a freeway over there, so there's no direct views. There's no access to the street at all. The little sliver, but the building wasn't visible. And could you somehow make housing work here? And it was sort of a super hyper-rational project where the approach to the building had to be that it needs to be lifted up, because that's the only way that you could actually convince anybody to live there. And so of course this cost money, talking about money again, but we had to then work the rest of the project to try to save the money that we would have spent by building this pancake up in the air by 35 feet. This is the poor man's real estate kind of thing, where you go up in a scissor lift and you shoot the pictures, as opposed to having a drone or something these days you'd be able to do, oopsie. So we did that, and we're sort of working on the real estate brochure as well. And but what happened is that hyper-rational in the sense that typically you would do housing in an orthogonal format. All your building materials are flat materials. There's no curved glass unless you're a Sana from Japan and you can afford it. But weirdly enough, as you do this, you discover that the donut shape is actually 30% more efficient in terms of being able to get the same amount of units, get enough perimeter for them for access to light and views, but then also your corridor space and the space, the dark space in the building is reduced. And so it's the most efficient form that way. It was a bit of a hybrid of construction. So we have concrete columns at the base, we have steel frame that creates the pancake, and above that is wood construction. It's only a 3-story building as far as the building code goes. So we had a lot of savings when it comes to some of the things that in the building code requirements cost more. The columns, just a small detail, were shaped to the radial pattern, and so there's all kinds of sort of architectural tricks in there. You can see the Ferris wheel of a base that got built up, and we convinced the prefab developer that this is easy, like the ground is just up. So here is the panels that, the roofs and the floors and the walls were all built as panels and lifted into place. You can see the project sort of half completed here. And in the middle of it is a concrete core where the stairs and the sort of scissor stairs and elevator are located. And again, in the 1950s, we occupied about 290 square feet of space, each one of us. Now that number is over 900 square feet. And so part of this was trying to convince Winnipeggers and the North Americans in general that, if you design well, then maybe you can get away with less. Now, there's going to be a little bit of sound in this. Not nearly as horrible. This is Ken. He is one of the people who's been with us since the beginning. His family of 3 lived in this. Each unit is 610 square feet. It's got amazing views, as I was saying so they're all pie-shaped, so it's pie in the sky. 2 levels of them, and there were 2 types of units, more traditional. But the benefit of it was that, again, you have this utility at the back of it, and then it splays out. You can fit the living and bedroom space at the front. And I actually lived in one of these units myself, and here's a view of that. This was when I was temporarily a bachelor? Is it a female version of that? Anyway. And so it was sort of an upgrade version. We had I had all the utility in one bar along the side of it, and then it could open. I had this fabulous bathtub in the middle of it, as you can see, which other people find weird, but you could also fill it with ice and have like a party. I thought was a brilliant idea. Anyway, there's the bathtub, and then you could open the kitchen wall and close it up, and so if you wanted privacy, you could certainly have it. And the rest of the bathroom is behind the wall, so the typical toilet, shower, and so on. And so these were different ways to kind of work with that slice, and there it is sort of in action. And again, as architects, we're always trying to figure out ways that we can bring the mundane, facade that is generated by housing. You usually have to line things up, and the windows are always lined up, and there's nothing new to invent in terms of facade. We're trying to figure out ways that we can make sense of the plumbing and the infrastructure of it, without losing money, making those connections simple, but still have variety on the facade. And so then in this case, again, we're working with flat materials. So we have faceting on the face of it. The windows are flat, but they're in smaller increments. And so we're trying to work with these fins that go vertically to mask the faceting of the facade. And then because of that unit flip, we can also flip the window pattern. And so these were some of the studies that were done on that. We also had a mechanical unit, a magic pack, I think they call them for any architect out there that might know what that is, that had to be hidden within the facade so that, that also becomes kind of absorbed in it. And I guess here's the sort of final result where, again, the faceting disappears a little bit and there's a deeper shadow line as a result of it. So this is looking up in the frame. And it is outside corridor, which is, you get some Okay, I hope the sound is not terrible, but you get all kinds of critics thinking that, why on earth would you do this in Winnipeg in particular? But the thing is that we don't treat houses any different. Like, why would we worry about building an indoor corridor? And as it turns out, it was a brilliant move during the pandemic because people weren't worried about being in the same indoor air with others, and it's also a place where residents kind of tend to gather and talk to one another. Much more feasible in the summer months, of course, but you can see how that works. And this is way cheaper. So we have a chain link fence here as a guard. You don't have to maintain or heat that space throughout the winter, which provides long-term costs that are much more feasible. And then, some architectural pictures there. My bike was often tied into the fence, as you can see there, and then we sort of like these contrast pictures with extreme snow and it kind of peeking past the units that you saw on the previous project in there. And then what happened is, of course, as many times happens, at some point our developer ended up owing us a bunch of money, and we negotiated with him that he should sell us the air rights to the rooftop of the core. And what we would do, it kind of looks ridiculous, but what we would do is build a unit up there. So instead of 40 units, 20 on each level, now became 41 units, and that we could, in exchange for that 15 grand, kind of like own that, and we would pay for the cost of building the suite. And it's become a short-term rental, but then we also give it for free for anybody who comes and visits the city. That's like a cultural leader or artist residence, have been several times, has been in films and different things. And so it's this glazed box where you can get a 360-degree view around the city. And yeah, you can find it on Airbnb, but if you come to Winnipeg, come and stay with us. I'll invite you for free. And so you can see it there. And it's another way to, again, aside from having to make up some of the costs that we spend on it, it's a way to try and entice this design culture, try and invite people into the city, having them experience it differently. But it's sort of in a super rough kind of edge of the industrial part. But so that's another kind of design-giving effort that we have. We also instigated this little project, which is a bunch of containers along a building that we actually ended up being able to acquire at some point. But anyway, so we had the building. This is city property. They had some really ugly sheds on the site. There's cultural events that happen here. This is where that cube was when I showed you first time. Anyway, and now it's turned into this, we actually paid for the one container. The two are the storage containers for the city lawnmowers and other cleaning equipment and so on. And then now it's a local bar, and they have a bunch of businesses from the area. Actually, you can order food to this common eating park space. And then, of course, we try to write about these things, propose the business ideas about how you densify Winnipeg and things like that. That was part of Innovative Solutions for Creating Sustainable Cities by the former Dean of Economics at the University of Winnipeg. And then another book there that you see. And then we tried to give back to the design events and things like that. Where my connection to Raleigh really happened was that I was at a conference speaking a few years back, and there was a woman there who was an urban planner who told us about this great thing that Raleigh has done, which is Walk Raleigh, and I'm sure you all know about that, but was sort of a guerrilla initiative back 2012, I think it was. Anyway, I was so inspired. I sat there and I thought, oh, I have to go back and do that for us. And so sometimes good ideas are worth copying. You don't have to invent them all. And they welcomed that from what I understood and what we researched. So anyway, so what happened is that our office then went out one evening, organized with these signs and tried to provide signage on how long does it take to walk from one place to another. Really tried to convince Winnipeggers that even though we're a car culture, just like you guys are, that it doesn't take that much to walk to the next destination, that really we should encourage that. And of course, told no one that we were behind this at all. It took 2 months, and then I got this letter or email from David Patman, who's the manager of transportation at the city of Winnipeg, that had sort of finally figured out who was behind it. And I thought that he just, the email was vague, so I thought he's going to want to give us a fine. But of course, fortunately, it turned out that his department was split halfways. He was for it, and so was a bunch of his people. And then there was the other half who thought that they should really go after us and punish us for this thing. Signs cost money and things like that. But now it's in the works that they want to make those permanent signs. Again, very much like in situ, we have a table, we've always had it, where we all sit around the same table. We talk to not only one another, so the junior person gets to hear what a senior person is doing on the phone and on their project, which is good, but we also have collaborations like Winnipeg Architecture Foundation occupies the space in front of our office, so they're more of a storefront too. They organize tours and events and things like that. The Design District Winnipeg was housed here for some time, and so was Storefront Manitoba temporarily when they lost their ED at the time. One of our developers, who is Calgary-based, has their place in the office as well. And somehow those kind of osmosis collaboration things really help. Should I try to stop, or what are we doing for time? Another 10? Are you, yeah? You're okay? All right. Well, then I'm going to present to you, I think, 2 more projects. This is one of them, and I'll skip the rest. This is called Pump House. It's one of my favorite projects that we've done, because it represents so many things. And you can see some of the stats here. We'll come back to that later. But really what it became about is this historic, I'm sorry, the picture is terribly pixelated, but this is the fire protection building that Winnipeg built after the big Chicago fire in whatever, 1918 something, turn of the century, to protect the city from a mass fire. And what it does is draws water from the river in order to be able to, fire suppress a fire. It's been sitting empty forever, and there were 17 different attempts to revitalize it, but it was a money pit because you'd have to preserve the pumps that are in there. They were by the same maker as Titanic engines were, so they're sort of historically important. But you couldn't, there's no foundation, there was not enough foundation to build here, and so it was kind of slated for demolition after all of this. And what sort of made a difference for us is, first of all, we found the developer, we did the pro forma, and then we connected the developer with our central kind of land development corporation for the municipal government, and so they could get some funding for it. We discovered that there's a crane in there that had to move the pumps around for servicing or putting them in place, and that already had a capacity that, we talked to the structural engineers that you could actually use that as opposed to having to build new foundations in order for it to support new floors. So all of a sudden, the pump house itself became feasible floor area that you could actually occupy. The second piece of information that was new was that people had looked at developing the site in the back, but not the one in the front. So this 40 feet was always just, because it was facing the waterfront drive that I showed you earlier, it was also deemed too small to be feasible for development. And then, but we figured that we could make housing work on that. So together with all those pieces, the housing in the back, or the development partial in the back, the sort of floor that we could slung into that gantry crane elevation above the pumps, and then the front piece together would give you enough project to make it worthwhile. And so it became these three similar slabs. One is single loaded facing the river in the front, and then 2 kind of double loaded, but exterior corridor, again, our way to save money in the back. And then about 15,000 square feet of that interior commercial space. So, and then there's also a restaurant off of this plaza into there now. You won't see it in the pictures. It was just sort of opened up this summer, and I didn't get around to taking pictures yet. But sort of this great intermingling. So these are hard projects because you're on one hand you're trying to adapt historic buildings, you're trying to add residential density, you're trying to intermingle it, you're trying to make sure that everything's happening. So there's no clear sort of party. Here's the new floor, so there's openings in there, and then we have 93 residential suites within those 2 blocks. I'm not sure if it's going to say that. Hopefully we get to the point here quickly where you can see kind of the beauty of that space. So new floors suspended, then we open some skylights into it, work experience, the pump hall as they come into work. It was an ad agency that we also found them a tenant. Here's the original picture of it, and I think we're going to move again, but there's hopefully no sound. There's no sound. Good. Use super simple steel studs that are just lightweight steel studs, painted them black, sort of trying to feed off of this original kind of pretty rough and ready industrial feel of it, and so it was super cheap. Then we put glass up, essentially, so the pumps are always present in the space, and yet it's using pretty sort of simple, straightforward materials, and the skylights above make the workspace sort of reasonable, that you're not, even though it's a deep plate, you're not searching for the light only on the perimeter. And let's see. So I guess we're just going to go back to this, and then the residential portion. Oh, one more thing. There's sort of a bleacher area. There's 24 stalls of underground parking below the bigger building block in the back, and so it's got kind of a bit of everything, but still pretty good ratio, 24 stalls to 93 units. And then this one, because of the historic nature of that facade, we had to lift up 2 levels, essentially to expose some of the facade, and then cut in so that you could get under and in between the pumps at the lower level to the bottom of it. So there's sort of a public plaza as well in there. The suites are super simple. They're either single level or they're skip-stop corridor types, so meaning that you save in efficiency. You don't have to have a corridor at every level, so you can go up. So we have accessible units on every second floor, elevator takes you up and so on. Or you can take a stair up to the upper level, and then you don't have to have the corridor repeated. So there's sort of the first building, and I think I've got a bit of the meandering route here. So this was in the winter. The plaza's not completed yet, but it is now. There's a barber shop there. There's the restaurant with the patio spilling up to here, so it's much more vibrant right now. But you can sort of see that all of these things together are kind of taking their cues from the warehouse district, and then trying to get people to move about the building as opposed to locking them into indoor corridors with carpet and I don't know, sconce lighting. And then there's, of course, a spectacular view of the river as you get higher up. The guardrail here is just perforated corrugated metal, as always for us, sort of different ways of using it. And then the units themselves, so from second level up, is wood frame, so that they're prefabbed again in the shop. And we have a nail laminated timber floors, which can be exposed. So that's sort of like considered heavy timber in the building code. And then of course you get this nice ceiling inside the suites that doesn't have to be drywalled over. And so let's see if I have anything more on that. A couple of sort of small details. This is Ken again, testing the type of stair that again is custom built from these parts that get to be bolted on site. They're sort of looking at the perforated material before it goes up, so it's really transparent, but then massing-wise, it again creates a variety on the facades. You can see it overlooking the river. And then the back building is just under construction, and so now, I have one more project, but a little interlude. Of course, we teach as well. We've been trying to teach about, we were in IIT, then I've been, just past term, I was at Cornell, trying to teach students about the money. because we know it's an enabler. We don't want you to get cynical as soon as you get out in the workforce, so you learn how details work. So we built one-to-one details and things like that, but basically doing housing, because we think that is where the future is, and having the students do things like they had to have their own performa. They had to constantly check their design against that performa to make sure that whatever design calls they were making, that they were reasonable and so on. And then I'm gonna skip something here, and then I'll do one more thing. So yes, sorry, one more interlude and then the one more project. So the platform middle is a book that we're writing currently. It was a symposium on housing that we organized at the IIT in 2019, trying to gather all of this information, put it in one place. What are the design tricks? Where can the architect actually make a difference? So it should be coming out at the end of the year. The recognition that in North America, when you look at those European magazines, you students out there, you're not going to be able to do that, because in North America, everything's driven by money. Second part, we have 2 exits, so that requires that you have a double-loaded corridor almost everywhere. Not required in like Latin America or Europe. I think most of Asia until you go really high. And then we don't have any public policies that govern quality. So we have a big uphill battle. Anyway, and this is what happens. So you could stretch your building, you have more window, you get great access to light at the back of it, which results in this. Like in Australia, there's a code that requires that you actually have a certain amount of sunlight hit the floor in apartment building setting. We don't, and so we end up with this at the bottom. And so the architect constantly works towards trying to solve that formula, solve that problem. And you can't get away with taking the contents out of any of these. You have to answer to all of them. And then, and then the last thing is this. We just finished Parkade of the Future. Now, why am I talking about parkades? This is Calgary. This is like a Texas of Winnipeg, of Canada, where cowboys thrive and oil is big and that sort of thing. But the Calgary Parking Authority was looking to do their last parkade ever, because they too recognized that I think it was 2015 or 14 was the year when car ownership peaked, and ever since we now have less cars constantly. The younger generations is driving less for the first time. Anyway, and so it's 510 stalls we were asked to build, but we had to think about how this could be converted right away, because we have the need for the cars right now, but we don't have it in the future. The site was super challenging. We had an LRT line, which is their light rail system, going underground. You couldn't put any foundations for a third of the site. It ended up being a big spiral donut for a bunch of reasons. But what's important about is thinking about buildings this way now is that what parts of them can be reused in the future. In our case, we made the whole thing, because the site was long enough, 1% slope. So you have no ramps that you have to remove in the future if you want to turn this into office or housing, except the single one that goes past an innovation center that's also housed there. There's already a bunch of activities there. There's an innovation center for 55,000 square feet. There's a cafe on the ground floor. This is the only thing that has to be removed when it gets converted into other uses. Even the pickets on the face of it become the residential balconies in the future. All the things are hidden. This is about I'll just show you a couple of pictures. The innovation center, we used scaffolding to do all of the bits in it. And the cool thing is that cars kind of drive through it, through the donut, as they get into the parking stalls. And we try to clean it all up so there's no mechanical bits that are hanging in there. Use kind of some of the lessons we learned from the 62M project, and these are the conversion strategies for future. So how do we think about buildings in a way that they can withstand that? Taller floors in this case, a little bit more structural capacity. The investment was about 20% extra in the beginning for this to be fully convertible and no waste in the future. So fortunately, the municipal government could see it. What's happened since is there's like this big Instagram thing where car guys go in there and they take pictures. It's pretty cool. I'm excited about it. Okay, so there you go. Thank you.
I think we all need a collective deep breath after that. That was amazing.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank
Sorry.
you. That was absolutely incredible. I think if you're up for it, I think we do have time for a few questions. If
I would
anybody,
love that.
if anybody has any questions, yes.
Hi. Well,
Hi.
That was amazing, just to say that out loud. But my biggest question would be, I know that you said that some of your structures were being built in before sketchy areas. And based on the things that we're talking about in the workshop, I was just wondering if your studio does anything about the people that were priorly living there in those areas, and like the problem with displacement and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
I was probably too flippant when I said that. Of course, when we were talking about that project where I said about UCube, it was an empty lot, so there was no residency there. It was industrial area, so the fact that we're bringing residents there would, start to transform the site from what are the uses that are no longer needed. We do a lot of affordable or socially supported housing as well in fringe areas, and a lot of the stuff that I didn't have time to talk about would go into that. But it is a big problem where we're on one hand trying to make sure that people who are more well off will move into these areas as well, and we have a healthy mix so that it doesn't get ghettoized. So we're trying to entice them at the same time as we're trying to make sure that there's enough affordability there. So there's some government incentives, but not enough, not nearly enough, for you to have mixed housing, so there's no so-called poor buildings or poor doors, so that we avoid the stigma. But it's a super important point, and I think anything that we do in housing and any development should consider that, absolutely.
I think we have another one over here.
Hello. Your presentation was amazing, but I'm just curious as to what sort of level of overhead you put forward, like at the start of your projects, in order to develop the numbers to present to the clients, so that you, as like a proof of concept, because that's something that can obviously get really complex and involved really fast. So if you could just go into that, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Yes, as I said, we got schooled by some of the developers in the beginning, and in effect kind of stole their spreadsheets and evolved them into our own. So the process is pretty quick now. We can do a formula like in our sleep, or a pro forma in our sleep for development. Know what the development costs, know what the real estate, what the carrying costs are, what the cap rate needs to be, things like that. So that's built in. And I would, if you're a young practitioner or in the field, I would recommend that that's something that really kind of tap into and know. It also, let's say that you spend a couple of thousand worth of fees in the beginning, that would be way less than we would spend on doing an RFP response, which is probably $15,000, $20,000. So that is definitely a smarter way, and oftentimes, very skilled developers and more experienced developers will have their own, and they don't need us. But it's the younger ones that are getting into the business, or somebody who just owns a bunch of property from their family or whatever, hasn't done this before. So that's where we run the pro forma for them, or if we see an opportunity, that we do that. And that's why I think it's super important for students to learn that right off the bat in school. But there were a lot of deer in the headlights kind of faces in studio, for sure.
Okay, go ahead.
So you showed the slide with the materials that you use based on its extremes of temperature. So how does beauty and aesthetic and nature get incorporated into your design process?
Do you mind repeating the question? Because she didn't have a mic.
Yeah,
and
she
I
was
wanna make sure the folks
asking,
online
I
can hear
think,
it.
in the sort of rudimentary materials that I showed, and how does beauty and aesthetic get incorporated into our projects. I think the bunch that I've shown are pretty sort of stark, pretty kind of architect taste-like. We have others. But I think in terms of working with those materials, we've been lucky enough to have this collaboration with the local fabricator. It's actually a religious colony, Hutterites, sort of north of the city. We have lots of these. They're kind of, I don't know if anybody knows what Hutterites are, but they're sort of, they're a religious sect that believe, they're almost like the Amish, but a little bit less rejecting of technology. And so they would have specialized colonies, for example, in CNC cutting and routering and water jetting and whatnot. So we've been working with one of those colonies forever where they will test things for us. This fellow named Melvin Kleinsasser is our like main contact, super smart guy. And so that's part of it. And then, there are projects that are more colorful, and there are projects that are that have more green space. I had to skip over one, especially where we're thinking about courtyards and trying to bring landscape into it. But also in Winnipeg, you have to think about that, 8 months of the year, it's pretty dead. So you play off the snow. You're trying to make your buildings generally darker so they stand against that contrast. In some of the early projects, for example, we had an image of a forest, and we painted sort of pixelated version of that on the facade. You saw that go by maybe in some of the facade images. And so there's all kinds of thought that comes to that. But I don't know. It just has to be built in, so it can't be something that's added later, and that's what I was talking about, the frivolous or the value engineering. We like to call it value architecturing. So we try to make sure that things can't be taken out that are fundamental to the project, and I think oftentimes the beauty comes from the fact that it was absolutely necessary, that there was no extra parts. And so our understanding of what beauty is maybe doesn't always jive with the public perception of that.
Hello. That was an amazing presentation and really inspiring. You talked about, kids self-identifying not by the building that they lived in, but by the natural space around it. And I loved the projects that you showed, and they also were, very disconnected from the space around them. They were 35 feet off of the ground.
Yes, that one in particular, yeah.
How do you, how was that decision made? How was that not necessary?
Well, in that particular case, because we were next to an elevated freeway, we were behind industrial sheds with blank facades, it was not going to happen there. And we have transient population that walks through there, and it's still sort of a fairly crime-ridden area. So it was one where you sort of accepted from the get-go that it's not going to be feasible here. In part, we'll have to take my word for it that, for example, the pump house has all of that. The project that I had to skip through has all of that. It's our dream to actually prove one of these, and I have other courtyard projects, would prove these in the inner city, that they're possible. When we think about the Barcelona block, or we think about, even in Helsinki, was all built that way, so that you would have a protected yard inside. One of our social housing projects that is just 10 units and little townhouses, the community voted for that to be in a sort of a donut shape, so that we would have a courtyard that's built in there. It's thriving. It's got beautiful trees inside, and people are taking care of it. It was one of the first sort of affordable condo units in the or condo projects that the Winnipeg Regional Housing Authority undertook in the last, I want to say like 40 years or something. They've been doing single family homes, and this was the first one that, again, like if, I could go back and show you some of that. Trying to find the balance between showing you architecture as a sort of capital A architecture and sort of the community-driven things. But there might be a disconnect from what I'm shown.
I think we do have time for one more if there are any other questions. Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk.
Thank you.